In September 2026, Tennessee is scheduled to carry out an execution that would mark a dark milestone in the state's history. If it happens, it will be the first time Tennessee has executed a woman in over 200 years. The woman at the center of this story is Christa Gail Pike, and what she did on a cold January night in 1995 would shock even hardened investigators. As you watch this story, tell us if you think she deserves to die or they should pardon her. This is a story about jealousy, brutal violence, and a crime so disturbing that it still haunts everyone who was involved in the case. But it's also a story that raises difficult questions about justice, age, and whether someone who commits a terrible crime as a teenager should face the ultimate punishment. If you're new to this channel, do well to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss any of our updates. Thank you. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Christa Pike was born in 1976 in West Virginia. Her childhood was marked by instability and trauma. She grew up in poverty, moving frequently between her mother's home and various foster care placements. Reports from her early life paint a picture of neglect and abuse. By her teenage years, Christa was already struggling. She had dropped out of school and was dealing with drug and alcohol problems. She had a history of violent outbursts and had been in and out of juvenile facilities. Her life seemed to be spiraling out of control. In 1994, at the age of 18, Christa enrolled in the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee. Job Corps is a federal program designed to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds gain education and job training. For Christa, it seemed like a chance to turn her life around. But instead, it would become the setting for one of the most brutal murders in Tennessee history. At Job Corps, Christa met Tatterell Shipp, a young man who would become her boyfriend. Their relationship was intense and troubled. Friends described them as obsessed with each other, but also volatile. They were into Satanism and the occult, often talking about dark rituals and devil worship. Christa also became friends with a young woman named Shadola Peterson. The three of them formed a tight group, spending most of their time together at the Job Corps Center. Then there was Colleen Slemmer. She was 19 years old, just a year older than Christa. She had come to Job Corps like Christa, hoping to build a better life for herself. She was described by those who knew her as kind and friendly. She had no idea that she would become the target of Christa Pike's rage. In January 1995, tensions began to build. Christa became convinced that Colleen was trying to steal Tatterell away from her. According to witnesses, Christa believed that Colleen was interested in Tatterell and was flirting with him. Whether this was true or just in Christa's imagination is unclear. What is clear is that Christa's jealousy quickly turned into an obsession. Christa began talking openly about wanting to hurt Colleen. She told friends that she wanted to teach Colleen a lesson. She talked about finishing her. Some people thought she was just talking tough, trying to sound scary, but Christa was serious. She began planning. She recruited Tatterell and Shadola to help her. The plan was simple and horrifying. They would lure Colleen to a secluded spot and kill her. On the evening of January 12, 1995, Christa put her plan into action. She approached Colleen and told her that they were going to walk to a nearby convenience store. Colleen, unsuspecting, agreed to go along. But instead of going to the store, Christa led Colleen to a secluded, wooded area on the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. It was cold and dark. Tatterell and Shadola came along too. Colleen still didn't realize what was about to happen. Once they were in the woods, far from any help, Christa turned on Colleen. What happened next was brutal beyond imagination. Christa attacked Colleen, hitting her repeatedly. Tatterell joined in. The attack lasted for over 30 minutes. Colleen begged for her life. She pleaded with them to stop. She tried to fight back, but she was outnumbered and overpowered. During the attack, Christa pulled out a small knife. She carved a pentagram into Colleen's chest, while the young woman was still alive. The torture continued. Witnesses would later testify that Christa seemed to enjoy what she was doing. She was laughing and taunting Colleen as she suffered. Finally, Christa took a piece of asphalt from the ground and smashed it into Colleen's skull repeatedly. The medical examiner would later testify that this is what ultimately killed her. Colleen's skull was fractured in multiple places. The attack was so vicious that a piece of her skull was found embedded in the piece of asphalt. After Colleen was dead, Christa did something that would become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case. She took a piece of Colleen's skull bone as a souvenir. She kept it in her pocket, and later showed it to other students back at Job Corps, bragging about what she had done. Colleen's body was discovered the next day by a group of university students. The scene was horrific. Investigators had seen a lot in their careers, but this was different. The level of violence, the torture, the obvious pleasure the killers had taken in their victims' suffering, it was deeply disturbing. The investigation moved quickly. Within hours, police had identified Christa, Tatarol, and Shadola as suspects. Other Job Corps students reported that Christa had been bragging about killing Colleen. Some had even seen the piece of skull bone she was carrying around. When police searched Christa's room, they found the bone fragment in her jacket pocket. They also found Colleen's blood on Christa's clothing. All three suspects were arrested. During interrogation, Shadola cooperated with police, providing details about the planning and execution of the murder. She agreed to testify against Christa and Tatarol. Christa, on the other hand, showed little remorse. During her interrogation, she was calm and matter-of-fact about what she had done. She admitted to killing Colleen but seemed to view it as justified. After all, in her mind, Colleen had been trying to steal her boyfriend. The trial began in 1996. Christa Pike was 19 years old when she sat in the defendant's chair. The evidence against her was overwhelming. There were witnesses who testified that she had planned the murder. There was physical evidence, the skull fragment, the bloody clothes. There were her own confessions. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer who had tortured and murdered an innocent woman out of jealousy. They argued that the crime was so heinous, so brutal, and so premeditated that it warranted the death penalty. The defense tried to present Christa's troubled background, her childhood abuse, her mental health issues, her age. They argued that she was a damaged young woman who needed help, not execution. But the brutality of the crime overshadowed everything else. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They also found her guilty of felony murder. Then came the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Christa should receive life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution argued for death. The defense pleaded for mercy, emphasizing her age and her troubled past. The jury chose death. On March 30, 1996, Christa Gail Pike was sentenced to die. At 19 years old, she became the youngest woman on death row in the United States at that time. Tatarol Ship was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shadola Peterson, who cooperated with prosecutors, pleaded guilty to facilitation of first-degree murder and received a 6-year sentence. For the past 3 decades, Christa Pike has been living on death row in Tennessee. Death row for women in Tennessee is located at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. Over the years, Christa has continued to be a problem for prison officials. In 2001, she was caught planning to attack and potentially kill another inmate. She had been plotting the attack for months and had even created a list of supplies she would need. This incident resulted in additional charges and further solidified her reputation as a dangerous and violent inmate. Throughout her time in prison, Christa's lawyers have filed numerous appeals. They've argued that she didn't receive adequate legal representation during her trial. They've pointed to her age at the time of the crime, arguing that executing someone for a crime they committed as a teenager violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They've also raised questions about her mental state. Psychological evaluations have shown that Christa suffers from severe mental illness, including borderline personality disorder. For years, these appeals worked. Christa's execution was stayed multiple times as courts reviewed her case. But each time, the courts have ultimately upheld her conviction and death sentence. The Christa Pike case raises difficult questions that our society continues to struggle with. Should someone who commits a horrific crime as a teenager be executed for it? Our understanding of brain development has evolved significantly since 1996. We now know that the teenage brain, particularly the parts responsible for impulse control and decision-making, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. The Supreme Court has recognized this in other cases. In 2005, they ruled that executing anyone who was under 18 at the time of their crime was unconstitutional. Christa was 18 when she killed Colleen, just barely over that line. There's also the question of mental illness. Should someone with severe mental health problems be executed? Christa's supporters argue that her mental illness, combined with her traumatic childhood, means she wasn't fully responsible for her actions in the way that a healthy adult would be. Now, Tennessee has set an execution date for Christa Pike, September 30th, 2026. If carried out, it will be Tennessee's first execution of a woman since 1820, over 200 years ago. That woman was a slave who was hanged for murder. As the date approaches, both sides are preparing for a final legal battle. Anti-death penalty advocates are mobilizing, pointing to Christa's case as an example of why the death penalty should be abolished. They argue that executing someone for a crime committed in their teenage years, especially someone with severe mental illness, is state-sanctioned murder, not justice. Prosecutors and victims' rights advocates maintain that justice requires that the sentence be carried out. They point out that Christa has had 30 years of appeals, far more process than her victim received. They argue that the brutality of the crime and Christa's continued violent behavior in prison show that she remains a danger to society. Tennessee governor and the state's board of parole will have the final say. They can grant clemency, commuting her sentence to life in prison, or they can allow the execution to proceed. As we move closer to September 2026, the legal maneuvering will intensify. Christa's lawyers will file last-minute appeals, possibly all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They'll argue that new evidence, new legal precedents, or changing standards of decency should prevent the execution. The state will argue that justice has been delayed long enough. 3 decades is long enough for appeals and reviews. And somewhere in all of this, 2 women remain at the center of the story. One is Colleen Slemmer, forever frozen at 19 years old, who will never get the chance to live the life she was building for herself. The other is Christa Pike, who has spent her entire adult life on death row for something she did when she was barely more than a child herself. Whatever happens on September 30th, 2026, it won't bring Colleen back. It won't undo the trauma and pain that this case has caused to so many people. It won't answer the fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and redemption that this case raises. What is your take on this? Do you think Christa should be pardoned with respect to her age, or she should fully pay for her crime? Comment below and also subscribe so we meet in the next video.